Okay, well, I'll go ahead and share screen then. And let's see what we've got. Hopefully everything's coming across okay. Uh, uh, so what I want to do today was, first off, I think a lot of you may not be really familiar with the ideas of Elinor Ostrom, who David has worked with, and she's a Nobel Prize winner. And in essence, what she did was she challenged some long-held beliefs among economists that natural resources are inevitably going to be overexploited. And the way she did that was by using field studies in small local communities. And she found that there was a commonality in how these local communities handled common resources like pastures, fishing waters, and forests. And just to give you a little quick sense, don't worry, I'm not going to be going into all of these at all. But just to give you a little sense of what she found was she developed some essential principles that were commonly found in these long surviving institutions that surrounded common pool resources. So among these principles, the first she lists was that of the boundary between the user and the resource. And of course, she found a lot of other principles as well. They had procedures for making their own rules. There were conflict resolution mechanisms and so forth. But what I really want to focus on in this talk is the idea of boundaries between users and resources being clear. And this, I have to take a little step back and talk about why I think this is so important. And I'll bring to mind a book that David mentioned, which I wrote and was published back in 2008. And it was Evil Genes: Why Rome Fell, Hitler Rose, Enron Failed, and My Sister Stole My Mother's Boyfriend. And in essence, the book was an investigation of why my oldest sister could be, let us say, so Machiavellian in her actions. And Steven Pinker wrote a very nice blurb about the book, that it's a fascinating scientific and personal exploration of the roots of evil and kind of basically nasty behavior that's not necessarily being a psychopath. One thing that I found was my sister had been a, shall we say, extremely problematic person. She was very charismatic, and yet she could take advantage of others quite easily. And so I wanted to know, how could someone do something like this? I mean, that subtitle, "And My Sister Stole My Mother's Boyfriend," was really true. She did steal my mother's boyfriend and much else besides. My poor, long-suffering parents had much to deal with. But I wanted to figure out, why was she like this? And I thought, now wait a minute, I am a professor of engineering. I know what good research is. Why don't I go and look at what the scientific literature has to say about, sort of Machiavellian personalities? And so I went looking in the literature. And what I found was something really rather surprising. I mean, first off, you can't just go into PubMed or something and type in "mean and nasty" and feel and get any kind of meaningful research results. So I began looking, and I finally found that there was a term for individuals who were, shall we say, successfully sinister. And this term, in essence, what psychologists had done was they had created a term for Machiavellian personalities, but there were thousands of papers about this malignant narcissism concept that was commonly used, but none of it, as in zero papers at that time, had any scientific foundation whatsoever. They were all sort of circularly citing one another with nothing based on neuroscience, nothing coming out of genetics, nothing solidly scientific at all. And I found it was a gaping hole in the research literature in the discipline of psychology. They're all citing one another about this concept that had absolutely no scientific foundation. So I think this is probably why Steven Pinker might have liked this book. And one thing that I found that was really quite interesting is that, well, I should point out first off that David wrote the foreword for this book. And this, in fact, is how I came to know David, because I found that his work in evolutionary theory was quite relevant to the kinds of things that I was trying to explore. In fact, an evolutionary explanation for these kinds of behaviors was really one of the best ways to understand why these kinds of behaviors manifest and why they carry forward generation by generation. So, of course, here's David as well, and he is the co-founder of Pro-Social World, and that's where I'm speaking today. So I'm very happy about that. But David's ideas really helped me to better understand why this kind of behavior arose. So one thing that I found as I was working on the book is that borderline personality disorder that my sister had a lot of the characteristics of this personality disorder. And a central feature of this personality disorder is real emotional instability. And a big part of it is that those with this disorder and related conditions have significant issues with boundaries. So this helped bring to mind for me the idea that even when it comes to something like empathy, that empathy can really relate to how we interact with others. And in that sense, it's almost like a common resource. It's not only that we have empathy for others, but others have empathy for us, or they can use our empathy in various ways. They can play on our empathy or use it for positive purposes. In that sense, empathy for others is kind of a common good, how we feel about others, and our compassion and empathy for others can be a kind of a common pool resource that others can draw on. So if you think about what is empathy, we often feel an emotional empathy for others. And as researchers have pointed out, this emotional empathy for others can lead to kind of bad results. I mean, it can cause us stress, it can cause bad health and burnout, withdrawal, and so forth. Something like half of all nurses who enter the field leave the field after they've been trained for so many years. And part of this is because it's so easy as a nurse to suffer from compassion fatigue and burnout. So one thing I think that is, if you look that one of those researcher papers that I mentioned is that by Klimecki and Singer, and it's about empathic distress fatigue or compassion fatigue. And this was a chapter in the book that David was also a co-editor on, Pathological Altruism. And so I just want to digress a little bit to talk about this work because it's relevant to the discussion of compassion and empathy as potential common pool resources. So when I worked on the book Evil Genes, it was a sort of I spent 6 years kind of sitting in a corner, more or less. I was also trying to get tenure at the same time, so I was sneaking off to work on that book. But once I got that book finished and published, I was invited to speak around the country. And one of the questions I got during these talks was the question of, well, we can understand why someone like Hitler might have had a nasty Machiavellian character. But what about all the Germans? I mean, they weren't all, nasty people. What about them? Why did they follow Hitler? And this also brought to mind the idea that I used to work as a translator on Soviet trawlers up in the Bering Sea. And part of what I found was that there are some ideologies that, when promulgated amongst a population who have little access to the outside world, the Soviet Union, for example, was really closed off from much of the Western world, that well-meaning ideas can go off on their own and create really bad situations. This is why so many millions were killed in Siberia and elsewhere by Stalin. As they used to say, you can't make an omelet without breaking a few eggs, meaning killing a few million who might have been caught saying a joke or something of that nature. So in fact, attempts to be altruistic, to do good things, can lead to good things, but can also sometimes lead to surprisingly horrific sorts of things. So all of this was kind of behind this idea of putting together an edited book that looked at the flip side of altruism, that didn't just always presume that our feelings of altruism for others are always a good thing. And to our surprise, I think, this book got a wonderful write-up in the New York Times, which generally never writes up a edited academic volume. And they gave just a really nice write-up, Natalie Angier. And she called it a scholarly yet surprisingly sprightly volume. And then it was also written up in the Wall Street Journal. And then there was an invitation to write an article for the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. And that also was well received. In fact, giving a talk for the National Academy of Sciences is on pathological altruism is how I met Terry Sanowski, who, for those of you from Learning How to Learn, it's, he is my co-instructor. So in essence, the path that began with David Sloan Wilson has led in interesting ways to a surprising turns in my career. But work on this area of pathological altruism has helped me to understand some interesting phenomena. And I think a way to best explain some of these ideas is to bring to your mind the idea of optical illusions. So if you look at these two tables, they look like they're very different in size. I mean, this looks smaller than this table. But I want to show you how our eyes are actually fooling us. If you look, this particular cover that I put on the top of that table, I'm going to move it over and show you that the other table is exactly the same size. And I promise you, there's no manipulation with warping and resizing. But if you see, it is actually, both tables have precisely the same size. But because of optical illusions, there's tricks that your mind is playing with you that tell you that one table has a different size from the other. And these kinds of optical illusions can also be, you might say that there's equivalent emotionally based illusions. We can have illusions of helping others. And the person I think who best illustrates these ideas is a woman named Joan McCord. She was the first female president of the American Society of Criminology. She's a fascinating human being. But what her specialty was the long-term follow-up of studies. Oftentimes what happens is someone will do a study to help a group, and they might, follow up after a couple of years or 5 years or something. Well, what Joan McCord liked to do was follow up long-term, as in decades, and see whether there was really a significant outcome as a result of these sometimes very expensive studies. And she became very well known for her follow-up of what was called the Cambridge Somerville Youth Study in Boston. And it was around a 5-year study that was conducted with 500 Boston schoolboys. What they did was they divided them into two groups. So 250 with the intervention, 250 without the intervention. Those schoolboys that had the intervention were given counseling. They had extra tutoring when they got stuck in school. They and their families had medical care, psychiatric care, and summer programs, all sorts of really good things. And the other group was given nothing. So they just went through life as ordinary. And after she followed up after 30 years and tracked down virtually every one of these former Boston schoolboys, and she found that one group was far more likely to commit a crime. They had more problems with alcoholism, mental illness. They had much more symptoms of stress. They died younger. They had lower prestige jobs. And in general, they had really rather unhappy lives. And which group was it? It's actually, of course, the group that got the intervention. And so what was odd about this whole study was it was so difficult for those involved in the study to imagine that their study could possibly have negative consequences, that they couldn't even see it. In fact, for the first decades afterwards, when they were studying, they were like, no effect, no effect, no effect. But mostly it was because they were not registering negative effects. And when they actually went in and so what McCord was doing was actually looking at the hard facts of what unfolded in those individuals' lives. And but the survey results of the former Boston schoolboys found that 2/3 of them had thought that the program improved their lives, no matter what the actual hard facts were. So this also tells you that surveying groups of people to see if your intervention is helpful is a really bad way to tell whether your program actually has been helpful, because people tell you what you want to hear. They like to make you happy. So McCord did, I think, phenomenal work in helping us to begin to understand that we really need to look with solid scientific, well-grounded eyes at what research studies are. And as she pointed out, many treatment programs and ways of helping others, they set up the evaluation of these programs to, in essence, show that these programs are successful. The evaluations are not set up to truly determine whether the program has been effective. So today, if you look, empathy is something that is like everywhere in society. The importance of empathy, listening with empathy, teaching children about empathy. If you look at schools and so forth, we need to teach about empathy. That's one of the foundational things that we should be doing. Yet, the reality is that altruism and empathy itself are more or less double-edged swords. Empathy can have very, very good characteristics, but it can also have problematic characteristics. If you're a young child in a school ground, or let's say with modern social media, it's found that bullies can really affect your lives. And why do they affect your lives? Because they play on your feelings for what they feel about you. When you're empathetic to a bully, you can feel terrible pain when they say terrible things about you. So you can also want to join a group, perhaps a group that's into drugs, and you're dragged in, how? By the hooks of your empathy, by wanting to be liked. So empathy really, it can have great characteristics, and we always teach about those great characteristics, but we almost never teach about the other aspect of empathy, that it can allow us to be hooked and dragged into pain and suffering. So I'd like to bring up, I taught as I was helping to co-edit that book, Pathological Altruism, I taught a college class for an honors college group on pathological altruism, which was great, and the students were fantastic. There was one student, though, and I noticed her right from the very beginning of class. She was always very reserved, very, kind of depressed in her demeanor. And sometimes she'd miss classes and she didn't interact like the other students did. And then about 2/3 of the way through the course, she started flowering. I mean, really blossoming. She came to life. She was interacting with the other students. And I thought, wow, what has happened with her? This is quite different. And when the course was over, she came to me and said, I had a real problem in that my brother, who I have long been close to, has been really, really depressed. And in fact, he has been suicidally depressed. And I thought that the best way to help him was, in essence, to share his pain. And the problem was that I also became depressed. instead of me kind of reaching down into the pit to help him out of the pit, he was reaching into me, up to me, and pulling me down into the pit. And when I began to realize that really he's a different person than I am, there are boundaries, I began to realize that he had his feelings, but that I didn't necessarily need to feel exactly the same way he did in order to, try my best to help him. Because certainly when I was feeling as he did, I was not helping him. And this brings us to that paper I alluded to earlier, the chapter from Pathological Altruism on empathic distress fatigue or compassion fatigue. And it's this, feeling what another person feels who's in terrible pain, or either psychological or even physical, is it can lead to burnout. And this burnout means that you're not really able to help very much. And some 40 to 80% of caregivers experience this kind of burnout. A primary factor in that burnout is the perceived suffering, and that can arise from your feelings of empathy that mirror the feelings of the person who is suffering. So I'd like to differentiate here. There are two ways of thinking about empathy, and we can actually see the differences between these two ways of thinking about empathy in how the brain reacts. So emotional empathy is like when you're really feeling with, you actually feel what they're feeling, as opposed to cognitive empathy, which is more like you're aware of what they're feeling, but you're not actually feeling the same feelings yourself. So let's look at this. If you are looking at something like your let's see, let me get this back up here. Whoops. So what can happen is, in essence, you can, if you are aware of another person's pain, it activates a tiny portion of the anterior cingulate cortex. And it also, the anterior insula as well. So being aware of and cognitively empathizing with someone else can activate a small portion of those areas of the brain. However, when you feel the same thing they do, you have that emotional empathy that you are sharing with them, that activates a much broader area of the brain. And those areas are, in essence, the same areas that are activated when you yourself would feel that same kind of pain. So if you think about empathy, if you have cognitive empathy for someone, you're like consciously, cognitively aware of their pain and suffering. In essence, what Klimecki and Singer were pointing out was it can lead to positive feelings like good health, pro-social motivation. Whereas if you have that much more comprehensive emotional empathy, that where you are feeling the same sorts of feelings that they're feeling, which are really painful, that is the kind of empathy that can lead to stress and burnout and withdrawal. So some of the feelings, I wonder that this can be related to why, for example, some types of meditation can be helpful in allowing you to differentiate between self and other. And the question to ask yourself is, which path do you follow? And the path you follow often relates to that self-other distinction. So a compassionate person can respond with feelings of love and concern for observed suffering. But as Klimecki and Singer say, they at the same time can be aware that it's not they themselves, it's not their own body doing that suffering, it's the other person. So in essence, it's becoming aware of those boundaries between you and another that can help you remember and avoid the kinds of empathy that can lead to burnout. Um, Basically, you can be, you realizing that you're different from that suffering person without being indifferent to the suffering person can be extremely helpful. And again, this just relates to that idea of Ostrom's of boundaries. So the compassionate person has a capacity to help because they're not overwhelmed by distress, but they can be guided by feelings of love, concern, or affection for the other. And all of this kind of different way of acting can have a big helpful effect on your family, loved ones, even those you work with. So this is a rather short presentation, but I just wanted to just bring back Ostrom's point of, related to common good and boundaries. And I do think that empathy for others is kind of a common good for other people. So in that sense, I hope that this might have given you some ideas to think about. And you may want to consider, for example, an incident where you have experienced distress fatigue. What might you have done in the past to help prevent that self-pain from arising? And what could we do from a societal perspective to perhaps make use of these ideas? So with that, I will stop sharing and I will be happy to answer questions.
Well, thank you, Barbara. I see that Brian is right off the mark. He understands. Oh, the pro-social regulars know that you raise your virtual hands and that sets up a queue. And so, Brian, let's kick it right off with you.
Oh, Barbara, thank you so much. Your presentation just opened for me a related area of study that I am sure is going just to pay dividends. But I have one quick question. With regard, can you give me enough information to find online the reference to the case study of participants that actually believed that they'd been helped by the program that they were a part of?
Sure. Let me get Joan McCord's wonderful study up here, the reference to it. I'll put it in the chat. Here we go. Okay, so there's Joan McCord's study. And if you kind of follow up with, and sort of see studies that have cited that, there's some really worthwhile follow-up studies.
Thank you so much.
Liano.
Okay.
Hi. Thanks. That was really great. I really liked that a lot. I wanted to that there was I like how you started talking about making the distinction between self and other at the end there. But I think that's an important thing to talk about in terms of the collective actions that we were talking about earlier. For example, I think that the issue with I think there's an argument to be made that the issue with the Nazis is that they bounded their altruism. They said, we're altruistic for this group, we don't care about that group, and we're willing to do whatever to that group to serve this group. So I'm I think that the reason the reason that happens, it seems to me, is because there are far fewer of us who have, well, all of us have the connection that you were talking about there at the end, but within the brain, but within society, those connections are mediated by stories, and those stories can be influenced by the community and individuals within the community, and they can drive that in different directions. And but I also think that's true about how we make a distinction between self and other, is the stories that we tell each other, that we tell ourselves. And so I have a whole thing about how cultures are built out of stories. But I'm wondering how do you see the connection, the connection between what you're talking about and the stories, the narratives, the values that we prioritize? What is there? How do you make that connection directly?
So I think what's important to bring out here, I have actually a bit of a few slides that might be helpful. So let me just share that you're bringing up such good points. And of course, that's part of why I was so delighted to share about these ideas, because it really helps to have wonderful insights from viewers to help advance and sharpen your own thinking about things. So the brain has two major pathways by which we can learn new things. And the first one, you might call it reason, but it's in essence declarative thinking that goes through that, the hippocampus, which is this blue area here. And then there's more procedural kinds of learning, and that goes through that basal ganglia, the red pathway. Now, if you think of that declarative hippocampal pathway as being like this sort of blue translucent box, and the procedural pathway as being like that gray non-translucent box, in essence, what you can do is you can say that your working memory loves to, those two systems, the basal ganglia procedural system is non-conscious, and the hippocampal system is conscious. So when our working memory is thinking consciously about something, we are, we're thinking declaratively, deliberatively, we're aware of what we're thinking. But what we're often not aware of is the subconscious or non-conscious thinking that is occurring based on the training that our basal ganglia procedural system has gotten. And this system is far more complex in some sense. And what can happen is this system can be sort of pre-trained by all that information you've gotten, and it produces what is called the value function. So all this early learning that let's say, as the Jesuits say, you're, give me a boy until the age of 70 or 7, and I will show you the man. In essence, what can happen is the procedural system is very powerful in young people. So all the experiences and data, so to speak, trains that system in a way that it can what it does is it subconsciously biases your conscious thinking. So what can happen is, if you are trained early on that a certain thing is a good thing, for example, kill all, green people because they're wicked and evil, you will grow up and you will find a way to, to come out that, hey, all green people should be killed. That's only logical and rational. And it's not, we're far less rational than we think we might be. So I think you're bringing up wonderful points. So this is how I think about those kinds of issues.
Great. So the quick summary that I like to say about this is that a culture is a network of value prioritizations that grows a set of narratives that flower into stories.
Yes.
So that the narratives get dressed up with the particular culture and fads change and things like that. But the system stays the same underneath until it's more directly challenged.
That's a much better way of putting it than I could have thought to do.
Okay, great. Al.
Yes, really glad to be listening and watching you. I read the book Mind Shift long ago. Now I want to read all of your books, I think.
Well, the best ones are the ones with David. Obviously.
Oh, that's really good to know. That's very good to know that he's working so closely with you. From both sides, honestly. Okay, now you're talking about two things. One is like empathy fatigue, which maybe I'm thinking like going back to the mirror neuron studies. It's like a monkey is in a lab and he's watching somebody flex their hand or pick up a pencil, and nerves fire as if they were telling his hand to do the same thing, but there's a boundary that stops those impulses from reaching the hand. It's the same as when we're sleeping and we are having impulses to move, and if we don't have some particular disorder, we don't thrash around in our bed because we're having all these impulses. I do sometimes, my wife tells me, but we're not supposed to. Now, here's what I tend to think, that on the other hand, we're talking about the empathy of psychopaths, the evil empathy of psychopaths, and we could also be talking about the empathy of a good warrior knowing their enemy. That's to me is a kind of cognitive empathy, or primarily. What it seems, okay, what I'm getting by making the connection to the mirror neurons and the blockage between the actual visceral empathy going on that keeps it from doing something, is maybe if you find a nurse who doesn't experience empathy fatigue, the reason might be that she has the ability to keep her own agency, to viscerally experience what the other is experiencing, but know that it's not, but at the same time feel her own agency. Like, okay, the other thing I think I tend to think about empathy is plural selfhood, plural commitments and intentions, which is a angle that some philosophers have taken, and also the scientist Michael Tomasello has particularly stressed. I hope I'm not kind of flailing too much, getting I'm getting kind of bowled over by thoughts about this. Am I making any sense to to you, Barbara, at any rate.
Yes, I just kind of keep thinking, oh, I agree with that. I agree with that. Yes, exactly. And I think you're perhaps circling around the idea that people use empathy for different purposes. They can have malevolent intentions, or they can have, good intentions. But even within those who have good intentions, one must look carefully, because, as they say, the road to hell is, paved with good intentions. And so I think, what you're trying to help us see more clearly are the motivations behind all of these things, as well as the outcomes.
Yes, I'm a little worried about making the distinction be between emotional and cognitive empathy.
Okay.
Suggests a possible alternative.
And if you actually look at the original Klimecki and Singer paper, they used slightly different terms. And the terms they used were, I felt that people were confused by those when I used them. So I brought in some new terms that are from that very recent paper that I also cited. And I kind of like this emotional versus cognitive, because I think it's a little clearer what those mean. And let's see. Oh, and we just got a question. Can I recommend literature on how to set healthy boundaries? And I think a very good, if you look at the old book, Stop Walking on Eggshells by Randy Krieger, it has some really good information on boundaries, and that relates very much to this. Randy Krieger. Okay.
Okay, great. So Ken.
Okay, thank you. I think the surface may have been scratched a bit from my question here, but I know you focus on the damage that improperly executed compassion can cause to the person doing it, but the recipient also, that can be a problem. For example, improper compassion can enable dysfunctional behavior. It can perhaps remove the person's agency. That's even been done. We can even see that on a national level, the way we treated Haiti in the 60s and 70s, giving them the sun and the moon, and look what came out of it. I wonder if you address that issue, and specifically, I wonder if you address it in terms of the mechanisms by which our thinking is so twisted that we come up with ideas for compassion that end up doing damage rather than the result we intend.
There's a really nice chapter by McGraw on codependency in the Pathological Altruism book. The idea of agency is a very important one, and that one Joan McCord has gone to the great beyond now, so I couldn't talk with her, but I spoke with her son, Jeffrey Sayre McCord, and Jeffrey thought that perhaps some of the differences that were observed between the two groups was a consequence of differences in agency, that they help inadvertently made the participants of the experimental group feel that they had less agency, that others were helping them, and so forth, and that this might have lied behind some of the what they observed. So I attempt to address these kinds of ideas somewhat, but I think there's much further, work that could be done in these areas.
Okay, I mean, I just wondered if perhaps Jonathan Haidt's observations about how we form righteous ideas, if some of that might affect the way we design things that end up falling flat afterwards. I mean, more cognitive bias, or what is it that? How is it that we go in feeling deep compassion and then everything just ends up falling flat?
There's so many ways to tackle that idea. I love Haidt's work. I think he gives some very interesting insights. But also, why do we, there's a wonderful book called The Master and His Emissary about the left and the right hemisphere. And it's by a psychiatrist. It's massively referenced. But in essence, when we learn something or figure something out, our left hemisphere is really just like, I'm right. And people with brain damage in the left hemisphere, or in one hemisphere, can actually begin to think that they are just right about everything because they don't have the corrective balance supplied by the other hemisphere. And in some sense, this is also what's going on in the scientific process itself. There's a wonderful book called, let's see, it's on the history of science. I'm trying to recollect the name. And the case he makes is that ultimately the scientific method involves the iron rule, and that means that an idea has to be put to the test. So if you disagree with someone about something else, then you both need to look at some experimental study that can prove one side right or the other side right. And if you still disagree about the results, then you just go back at it with a new experiment and so forth. But that interacting with others can help us avoid that feeling of that incorrect feeling of rightness that can sometimes arise just because we've created a program or a mechanism or something like that. And it's people just, it can make them feel very uncomfortable they can feel so right about their development of a program or whatever that they don't, most of the time, people just don't really fairly evaluate programs. And this, for example, in the field of education, did you know that only 0.13 educational research studies are replicated? 0.13, that's less than 1%. And so that means that people in education can go around, all they have to do is just get something published and nobody's ever going to check their work. So the result is that there's all these big fads in education. The latest fad is the best way to learn math is you have the children standing upright and writing on vertical surfaces, that's really going to make a huge difference in their ability to learn math. What kind of replication studies have been done to verify this kind of thing? Well, actually, if you look, you won't find much. And, and people just, it's less common to find someone who is, but not impossible, to find people who are willing to put their ideas to a scientific test. And that's really what needs to happen, because we all have sort of narcissism and we all have those feelings of rightness. And it's the scientific process that can actually help us, getting criticism from others. And this, I think, is also why ideas related, I'm working on a MOOC right now, number one, related to critical thinking, but also drawing in ideas related to free speech and why free speech is important. Because so often, if someone says something you don't like, you want to shut them down. And that, if they're criticizing you, yet this is a healthy thing for a functional society to have this kind of criticism to avoid these problematic and erroneous sometimes feelings of I'm right.
Okay. Thank you. Would you agree that that's a problem on college campuses today?
I think I would heartily agree with that.
Thank you very much for your work, Barbara.
Oh, thank you.
Right, so, so Barbara, you actually took this in a different direction than I expected. And the direction I expected perceives the courtesan principles as something which is needed for all forms of cooperation. So in a group that strongly implements the courtesan principles, if you behave pro-socially, then you can safely do so. You will not be exploited. And if a group does not, then your pro-social behavior is likely to be exploited. So the caring commons, if you try to be caring in a group that's lacking the courtesan principles, it will not go well for you. And the direction you took it distinguishes between different motivations, the emotional empathy versus cognitive empathy. Both of them lead to an attempt to be empathetic in action. So, I mean, your distinction is an important one. But I just wondered if you could speak to the other distinction, which without inquiring into proximate mechanisms, just notes that environments, groups differ in the degree to which it's safe to be pro-social. And this also bears upon free speech. Now that you introduced the concept of free speech, that if we think about speech as a social behavior, like any other social behavior, there must be something, the courtesan principles of graduated sanctions needs to come in, that if your speech is harmful, just plain harmful, to a social enterprise, a form of selfishness, there must be a way to combat it. So all groups have norms of good behavior, whether it's expressed as speech or in any other form, which prohibit certain behaviors. And that has to be true for speech as well. So, anything goes for free speech, I think can't be right. So maybe you could also address that issue while you're at it.
I think you're bringing up really fascinating ideas that do relate at a core level to what I've been speaking about. And it's sort of like the reality is within any group, you are going to have people who are going to, if it's large enough, you're going to have people who are going to want to spin that group for their own advantage. You're going to have people who are deeply narcissistic who may be able to hide it. And if you assume that everything is all going to work great in the group, because the group is all filled with nice people, your group is going to work just terrific. But that's not human groups. Human groups are always going to have some malevolent characters and bad actors. So whatever group setup that you have, they have to also be able to accommodate when there are people who are taking advantage of of the system. And then so that comes to free speech as well. You can always say, well, there should be sanctions and so forth against someone who is hurting others. But if you can claim that you are hurt by someone's free speech, then you can abuse that privilege. And it's really easy to shut anybody down because you can say, oh, you're hurting the people by your whatever you're saying. And so I look at Ibn Khaldun, the great sociologist from the 1400s, I think it was. And he was a wonderful, sort of like the father of modern of sociology. He really thought about the ideas. I think he was involved in some kind of siege in Damascus, I think it was, and the besieger, maybe it was Tamerlane, found out that Ibn Khaldun was there. So he stopped the siege and said, lower him down I want to spend some time just speaking with him and his ideas because they're so helpful. And his ideas involve the concept of abaya and how group cohesiveness can arise. But interestingly, Ibn Khaldun also ended up towards the end of his life. He thought very deeply about things, and he offended religious authorities. So he ended up sort of, as I recall anyway, sort of imprisoned and so forth because he said some things that hurt people's feelings. So we had to be really careful because it just sounds so good. It's so altruistic that if someone says something that hurts somebody's feelings, we should be able to shut it down. But the reality is, like, if I'm talking to a racist, I want to know that person's a racist. I don't want them to be hiding this. If they declare themselves publicly with free speech as being a racist, at least I've got their number then. So we just had to be really careful because it's so easy to abuse that privilege of shutting down
Yeah, so I want to get onto Cindy, but I still feel I want to push back a little bit. But if you look at all of the contexts in which factual truth matters, such as science, court proceedings, responsible journalism, there's norms of truth telling in this case. But and if you violate it, you're out of there. There's things you can't say in those contexts because it's very, very important to know the facts of the matter. So I think that I take all your points and the kind of the idea that you're hurting me, therefore don't speak. Yeah, that's not what we want, but that's not to say that anything goes. Anything does not go in these contexts that I've.
No, but I think we're talking about the same thing, really, because when I'm talking about free speech, I'm not saying that you can go into the scientific literature and just make stuff up, So we're talking about, I think it's pretty clear the kind of context that I'm describing, and I think we are aligned in those contexts.
Yeah, so let's I get a chance to talk to you often, so let's pass directly to Cindy.
Okay, great. So this kind of clarified for me something that's going on in my own life, which is that I teach a remedial course, college algebra. I get students intimidated and terrified of math, and they introduce themselves as being bad at math. And so my goal is to kind of turn that around. And what I've been finding recently is that I'll have a carefully prepared lecture, and about 3/4 of the way through, I become I look at my students, I see their ambiguous feelings, and if they're feeling ambiguous about it, I start to feel ambiguous to the point where I can't even function by the end of the lecture, which I think sounds crazy, but I start to feel weighed down by what I am assuming are their feelings. And I didn't really understand this was going on until I heard you talk. So I thought that was really interesting and a challenge to me to try and figure out more effective boundaries. And I think part of the way that I came by this teaching strategy, so to speak, is that I very much admired a voice teacher that I knew. He's very, very excellent. He would give these master classes where he'd have somebody perform, and then he would start to diagnose what they needed to do differently with their voice. And what he said he did was he joined his larynx to their larynx. He could physically feel in his body what they were doing that was causing blockage or lack of freedom or whatever. And I thought, oh, that's amazing. I want to teach the same way. I want to feel inside of me what my students are feeling. And I think that that is actually not helping, because I end up, instead of putting them in my world, I don't know if you ever saw that movie, The Cell, but the heroine comes to the conclusion that instead of traveling into the mentally ill person's mind, she had them invited them into her mind. And I think that would make more sense. I'm sorry, I'm talking really fast. Is that making sense?
Oh, this makes perfect sense. Yeah, it's it's so easy to feel that if you're feeling what they're feeling, and I think that if you are an actor, or you're a dance teacher or something like that, that it's perfectly good to feel the emotion, or, feel what the other person is feeling and to mirror and mimic that. But you have to just be a little careful sometimes with a situation that's of the kind that you were talking about with your class. I mean, it's valuable to know that your students are feeling overwhelmed and to have that cognitive empathy that they are that way, because that can help you think cognitively about new strategies that might help bring them on board. And I have to mention the work of John Mighton. He has a program called Jump Math, and it might be really helpful for you. He comes at it with a very interesting. He's a playwright as well as a professional mathematician. So he does think about things emotionally. But anyway, it might just give you some ideas, and I think you're spot on with your students. It's the same as it was with my, when I first began teaching, I was very empathetic with my students, but after a while, I began to realize that if you're sharing what they're feeling, sometimes, particularly if you have there are some students that are what they call sticky students, that no matter how much empathy, care, and love that you might give them, it's not enough. And then you can find yourself burning out in those kinds of situations.
Okay, great.
Thanks. Oh, I'm sorry.
Thank you, Cindy. Patrick?
Well, thanks, Barbara, for your work. I'm a teacher as well, and yeah, thanks for Uncommon Sense Teaching and all the books around teaching and learning. I had a counselor one time who said, like, I'm paid to care a medium amount, talking about boundaries. And I kind of think about that as a teacher sometimes, of like, am I striking the right balance, or am I carrying the medium amount right now? Which I think is, I don't know, it's been a helpful phrase for me to think about. But in helping professions, therapists, teachers, I think there's this mythology around when we get into teaching or any helping profession where you have to care, just do what it takes to get the outcome for a certain kid or a client. Maybe I can't speak to the therapy world because I'm not a therapist, but definitely in the education world, that's the case. So my couple of questions. One is, like, how do you see inroads into transforming that culture? And then secondly, like, social emotional learning is such a buzzword in education, and I'm sure there are evidence-based approaches to it, but it seems fairly scattershot with lots of different modalities and ways of doing it. Certainly setting healthy boundaries should be part of social emotional learning. Do you have any resources for teaching students healthy boundaries?
That's a really good question.
Yeah, those are my two questions.
That would be wonderful to have. So one thing that I did, there's something called, let me look this up, but it's essentially a paper that I wrote to help students and teachers learn about boundaries. It's called Coping with Hitchhikers and Couch Potatoes on Teams. And this article it's actually been cited by, I don't know, over 1,000 on Google Scholar. And let me find the Google Scholar reference. Let's see. So here's a copy of the paper. And this paper, I wrote it to help teachers. The idea is it's a description of a typical team. Well, it's kind of maybe an atypical team in that it has you as the person, you know, and you're just kind of a medium learner. And then you have other people on the team. One of them is kind of lazy, but they're not dumb. They're just really lazy. And there's another one who is, you know, really, really happy to take advantage of the other people on the team. So they always say things like, "Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't get that message. I didn't have your email address, so I couldn't, like, you know, fulfill this thing. I didn't have this." They always have excuses, you know. And this paper tells you what to do when you have a team that has members on it like that. It tells students. So what I suggest people do is hand this essay out to their classes where they're working in teams, having their students work in teams, and then they have to write a short paragraph. This was pre-ChatGPT. The idea was to ask them to write a short paragraph about this essay, and that would just at least show that they read the essay. And what this essay does is it puts the students who would take advantage on a team in a class on notice that the instructor is aware that there can be a small percentage of students who can take advantage. And this helps minimize this kind of hitchhiking behavior on teams, because part of the real problem is, well, as this essay describes, here's how you set up boundaries. And, you know, you have to be able to say no sometimes. It's going to be very painful for you. Some people are especially empathetic. Those are the ones who listen very carefully when they're told to be, that empathy is a great thing. So they're great students and they listen and they incorporate that into their self-identity. And so it can be very painful for them the first few times they say, no, that's not acceptable behavior. But this paper sort of begins teaching them how to do it.
Yeah, Patrick just mentioned that, but I want to move on, so I'll say something a little bit at the end. So Viveka, please. And then I'm going to skip directly to Sally, if you don't mind, Helena, because Sally hasn't spoken yet. And then I think there'll probably still be room for your comments. Viveka.
Yep. Thank you.
Okay, Sally, after Viveka.
No worries.
Thanks, Barbara. It's great to hear your talk on this. And I'm a psychologist and I work as a psychotherapist as well, among other things. And I face this challenge a lot with clients, and of empathizing as well as helping to redirect. And in fact, just that, connect to redirect is one way I think of this. Oftentimes for deeper procedural learning, you know, when, as you mentioned, there is a motivational piece here. Where is that person coming from and what is it that they are needing, you know, under their you know, reactive or defensive or whatever sort of top layer impulses, and there's what's the need. And so to access that, to kind of sink down a bit, right? Empathy is often a helpful start. And that doesn't mean that we end there or that we give up, you know, ourselves. It's also then to help, but for children, connect to redirect is one, like David Siegel, lots of people talk about. So just in this kind of as empathy, the cognitive and the emotional part, we can, you know, integrate them, and it depends on context, right? And so in certain contexts, we, like a unit educator here, it's often more top down and cognitive first, and when we notice that fatigue, right, so that we need to kind of adjust. But for I think more emotional procedural learning, and where there's a lot of implicit biases, right? We often need to spend a little more time. That's my experience, right? And because of my domain. But it's also very like, how do we scale that? I think those, and so these are some of the questions that come to mind, and just from your talk, and both the sort of understanding where people are coming from, that motivational piece, and also for them to understand what's the effect, what's the impact, right, on what I'm doing and what I'm saying, or my behavior on others, and am I open to receiving others' input on me, right? The influence of others on me. So that's a cycle, right? Where I'm coming from, my impact, and how am my openness to receiving others. This is a relational science, if you will. I could speak about it in different terms that would have also the right references for you. But that cycle, I think, is where what you're tapping into. And for some people, our biases into more to if I'm needed and if I'm wanted, I feel good maybe about myself, right? And so but that's like unsustainable long term. So then to sort of how do we observe that, and how do I like sit with that and reflect that? And then what are the boundaries to establish that are respectful and clear? I mean, this can be tricky stuff. But I guess I'm wanting to point out this sort of cycle in that relational space that you're tapping into here. That's partly each one to observe in themselves, I believe, but also I think in the group and in this from David's work and the prosocial idea, like in the group, the idea is that many of us self-correct, right? In that context, we sort of learn from cues and others in the majority, and we sort of start forming and shaping based on that. But for that to really kind of sink in, there needs to be safety in the group, right? And courage to speak.
Those are all great points. I always, worry a little, because as soon as I hear someone say, this is a group where safety is emphasized, then I realize that I'm in an unsafe group. Because if you say something that makes somebody feel bad, so then you start watching everything you're going to say. But I love your idea of connect to redirect, because it will, if you think about it, if you've had traumatic experiences, if you, we know from educational theory that retrieval practice, that is bringing things to mind, can really help strengthen and build those things. So, coming back to your comment of connect to redirect, I think and I'm a big fan of, or I was a big fan of Queen Elizabeth. And what Queen Elizabeth would do is when she would have someone who was connecting with her, who had experienced a lot of trauma, clearly, what she did was really emotionally quite astute, I think. She would connect with them about their experience, and then she would redirect the discussion to something else that was not as traumatic. And, this was her way of, I think, probably avoiding burnout with all the people that she would be constantly meeting, some of whom had gone through really hard experiences, but it also left those she was with, they often felt uplifted. And I think it was her astute use of connect to redirect rather than to emphasize those sort of feelings of trauma, perhaps.
Oh, that's fascinating. Sally.
Hi, I've never spoken on here before. I'm a friend of Susan Soleil's, who's part of Prosocial, as far as I know. Barbara, it's amazing to meet you. Apologies, I arrived a little late, so hopefully I'm not saying anything redundant. I took your MOOC several years ago, and I've read some of your writing. I was originally trained as a middle school sciences teacher, but then I had a sort of multi-decade journey through industry, government, and most recently academia. And I started out as a computer scientist, but then I shifted over into veterinary medicine and biomedical sciences. And I'm on my own now, and I'm working to build consulting and curriculum around gaps that I perceived when I was an academic in our training and our education of scientists. And most people kind of know the classic stereotypical awkward scientist who doesn't know how to interact with the rest of the universe. What I wanted to ask you specifically, though, was how do you help people to learn how to identify their gaps in some of these social skills? Can you point me to some resources? Because it's not so much that I'm the expert on all of those, but I want to be able to coach and educate people to how to get started on filling some of their gaps that they've had because they've been in a sort of tunnel vision education channel and not really learned a lot of these other skills they need to be successful in their profession and in life.
That is such a great question. And to answer that question, what I would do, I would go to Claude 3, which is my favorite large language model. And it is quasi-human in how it answers things. And it's doing better on some tests than ChatGPT and than many others.
Which I've been using for the same questions out of curiosity. Yes.
Yes.
Interesting.
But
okay.
When you mention curiosity, that's part of, so what you want to do is, it turns out that if students are made to be curious about something, it sparks their curiosity. What that does is it sends, dopamine through the system. And I'll show just very briefly. I'm terrible. I can't help it. But let's see, where is this? Let's see, PowerPoint show. Okay, let me just get this back. And okay, so I'll share here. Curiosity is like super important. And so, actually, I have an even better one that I have to show you.
And most scientists have a lot of curiosity. So that's what I want to tap into.
Yeah, there's a wonderful book called The Alignment Problem that talks about how they are developing AI systems to be curious. And you might say, well, how on earth can you develop an AI system to be curious? But the fact of the matter is that curiosity often involves things that we haven't seen before.
Yeah, and they're not in our contextual web. We just don't know about them, right?
Right. Yeah. And so they can actually measure, sort of why is this not showing? Okay, screen. Okay. So they can measure whether something is new. And and they can quantify that, and that can help them to actually develop better ways of identifying when someone is curious about something. So anyway, let me hang on just a sec. Okay, where are we? Okay. So here we go. Okay, so hopefully you're seeing the value of good hooks here.
Yes, I am.
So ultimately, dopamine it's actually an anticipatory molecule that is released when we get unexpected rewards. And that release happens, there's dopamine neurons in the brain. It spreads, dopamine can spread it all over the brain, but it particularly can home in on areas where we're thinking about something that we're curious about. Interestingly, mice that get their little dopamine systems inactivated cannot learn anything new. So dopamine is really important for learning. And it happens like this. Like if you're curious about something and you try some problem solving approaches, you're following these neural sort of pathways to try to solve a problem. You can't get it. Finally, you try an approach to problem solving, you get a solution, and that aha feeling of I solved it, I got the right answer, it is the truth, is it sprinkles dopamine along that most recently used pathway, and that allows us to build those sets of neural links that are involved in us learning new things. Incidentally, if you're curious about things, it helps enhance your focusing, and literally your visual field kind of darkens where you're not focusing. And so it suppresses mind wandering. And so you can ask Gen AI for ideas to help promote curiosity. So like a couple of weeks ago, I was in Mongolia on the most pathetic looking Mongolian pony that you've ever, things are like tougher than, and they were telling me, they're like, our Mongolian students, they get super bored when we're trying to teach them about, main guard versus scope in Python programming. How can I connect those ideas, to the nomadic ways of life of my students? And so I went and asked ChatGPT, and it gave me these great metaphors for, tents and herding and so forth. So, more than just asking specifically, how to identify gaps, how to make them curious about these gaps. Because then when their curiosity is satisfied, it'll help them like really link in those, those concepts more deeply, and also ask for good metaphors. That is really helpful too.
Amazing.
So it's the relevancy thing. It really needs to connect to their existing network. Okay. Thank you so much, Barbara.
They're great. We're a little past time, and so first of all, I want to note people should definitely feel free to leave, and thank you so much. But then, Barbara, if you can stay on just a few more minutes, let me ask Hal and Leonor to speak their questions in turn, and then you can provide a single response. Okay?
Okay. Oh man, I've got to remember the various questions. Then.
So Hal and Leonor, go ahead.
All right. You probably won't confuse the questions. I just want to say a word for politeness and even PC with moderation. I think we have two opposite tendencies. One group of people, especially some ultra academics, who were always finding a new way to find something slighting to someone. And on the other hand, people who want to use racial epithets freely, and they reinforce each other. And I think in the Enlightenment, part of the Enlightenment was becoming more polite and not allowing certain people to walk all over other people in speech, so that everybody had to kind of talk in an egalitarian way when they were discussing scientific things, and that made things move forward, in my opinion. So that's my comment.
I affirm that. I mean, I thank you, Hal. That's a very important point. The norms of politeness, I think, because it's one of the things that marks academic culture, or at least should. But Leonor.
So make sure. Yeah. Okay. So I want to go back to that experiment that was done with the two groups of students. And from my perspective, the natural consequence of the model that we both came at from different directions is that what we did is that we trained them at a young age that people are supposed to help each other. And then we stopped giving them that help, and they went out into society and found that society doesn't work that way. So then they have a mismatch between the values that they grew up with and the values that are being expressed in society. And that's what's causing that issue. You mentioned that you had looked at it from a different perspective. I was wondering if you had any reason to think that this was not a good explanation.
It's really tough because I've read countless accounts of, for example, some wealthy individual reaching out and providing the support that a train porter needed to actually attend college. And so he supported, he was very impressed with this train porter and gave the money for this person to go to college and attend. And I think, so I am deeply confused myself about what the real, because helping others is it's not a bad thing, but it just needs to be. One thing is like that rich guy who helped the train porter, he was really looking at, I know this guy's going to use this wisely, and so forth. So maybe it makes a difference who might get the help. I don't know. This is a very deep question that involves all sorts of, personality characteristics, I think, as well. So, yeah.
I think the key difference there is the age difference. The age difference between the porter who's going to college and the kids who are in much younger. The brain is developing.
Yes, this is a problem. Like the dimensional space of solutions or answers to the question that you're posing is so immense that we could probably spend several lifetimes discussing the possible, depending on the students, their backgrounds, or all these different things. It's a really good question.
Well, I think that one of the great things about what we're trying to do here with Pro-Social World is to set up a process of continuous engagement. So this is not a one-off, not at all. We have the opportunity to return to these issues again and again, and to bring in great people as we have today. So Barb, first, let me thank you so much. And I guess we can do a little bit of round of applause here. And thanks everyone for joining in. And this conversation continues, and I'm so happy to create a scaffold or an architecture for this kind of conversation to continue. So
kudos to you. Kudos to you for building this fantastic platform.
Thank you so much. And so until next time, thank you, everyone.